Hello everyone. In this chapter of Life on Planet Earth, we are going to address evolution. So we're going to take a quick overview of evolution and the role Darwin played in the development of the concept of evolution. Now, let me say up front that Darwin was not the only naturalist who observed organisms around him as he was traveling the world. Many other people also made observations and came to the conclusion that life changes over time by actually adapting to its environment as the environment changes, right? So as word of introduction, you see here on this slide some bacteria infecting human mucous membrane. These bacteria are particularly the instance of Neisseria gonorrhoeae. Neisseria gonorrhoeae actually is responsible for a sexually transmitted disease that can be treated with antibiotics. Now, there is about 800,000 people around the world each year who are diagnosed positive to Neisseria gonorrhoeae. I don't know if I already said this, but Neisseria gonorrhoeae can cause infertility if not treated, right? Or properly treated. So what we also observe is that the misuse and the overuse of antibiotics is causing this infectious agent, Neisseria gonorrhoeae, to exhibit resistance to the antibiotics that we typically use to treat the infection. Now, this is not the only organism that is exhibiting such behavior. When you consider, for instance, tuberculosis, right? In the case of tuberculosis, we use two types of drugs, first-line drugs and second-line drugs. The first-line drugs are these drugs that are used primarily when someone is diagnosed positive to tuberculosis. Eventually, if someone exhibit resistance to first-line drugs, then we prescribe second-line drugs that oftentimes are used as second-line drugs because of the toxicity that they can have on the human body. Now, with the development of resistant strains of Neisseria gonorrhoeae, there are a few questions we need to ask. How does natural selection play a role in the evolution of antibiotic resistance in the case of Neisseria gonorrhoeae, in the case of tuberculosis, right? The organism that causes tuberculosis, it's Mycobacterium tuberculosis, right? You've also, I'm pretty sure you also heard of methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus that is responsible for staph infection. And actually MRSA, the superbug, is developing resistance to the very drugs that are used to treat staph infections. How is natural selection playing a role in the development of resistance to this antimicrobial? And let me mention that the development of this drug-resistant bacteria, it's a proof of evolution of microorganisms from a state of sensitivity to a state of resistance. Now, to come back to Neisseria gonorrhoeae specifically, what kind of adaptation are the gonorrhea bacteria exhibiting as they show resistance, right? So we have, with the case of bacteria that we try to destroy because they are causing us to be sick, as evidence of evolutionary change that happened. Now, we are going to go more back into the history, right? Into the history of evolution and how we came to show that actually living organisms do evolve over time, and that evolution is controlled by the concept that we call natural selection, which is basically, in other words, survival of the fittest. So the environment changes, and only organisms that are suited to thrive in that environment are going to live. Everyone else is going to die. All right, with that being said, now Darwin actually traveled the world. He traveled the world on the HMS Beagle. Now, Charles Darwin actually traveling the world from Europe to Africa to South America made a number of observations. The observations he made were that, well, an organism such as this organism here, the ree that is actually found in South America, was interestingly similar to the ostrich that is found in South Africa, right? So he tried to understand what is the reason for such a high similarity, right? He noticed that in the island of Galapagos, you have this marine iguana that are very unique to that island. Why is that this marine iguana are so unique and isolated from the remainder of the world? What happened there? So he made a lot of observations, and as he collected, crunched all the observations and started drawing conclusions, he actually reached a very specific conclusion that we are going to address in a minute. But before Darwin, Darwin used the work that other people had done before, including geologists who actually observed the earth, the crust of the earth. They would analyze the crust of the earth, and geologists thought, well, why creationists say that the earth is about 2,000, 4,000 years old, it seems that the earth is actually much, much, much older than that, right? And as people started thinking that the earth is much older than what we traditionally think, the question is, was life in that earth at that time? Well, people started suspecting that yes, there was life. And that life, some of it is gone extinct. Some of it still exists today. At least variations of this life, right? So the fossils, which are dead organisms that are trapped and never been decomposed, right, are showing the specific shape they had when they were alive. So you've heard of fossils, and the fossils that are trapped in strata, and the strata are layers of rocks on the a cross-section of the earth that actually show that living organisms existed at some point. And what geologists show is that the old strata are at the very bottom of the crust of the earth, or the cross-section of the earth, while the new strata are going to be on top, right? So that if we know the age of rocks where fossils are being found, we can also deduct the age of living organisms that were on Earth at that time, and realize that, the Earth is very old. And actually, the estimate of the age of the Earth, it's about 4.5 billions of years. While the first form of life can be traced back to 3.5 billions of years ago, right? So George Cuvier was a French guy. He was a naturalist, and he observed a lot and said that, well, the earth has gone through some periods of catastrophes. And these catastrophes caused the wipe down of the populations that existed on Earth at that point when there was that catastrophe. And eventually, after that catastrophe, there are new organisms that are going to repopulate the Earth at that point. Then you had Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck came with the concept of adaptation. He said that organisms in a given environment are going to adapt. They're going to build on features, physical features. And these physical features, they are going to pass these physical features down after building them up through their life. For instance, if you consider Arnold Schwarzenegger, Arnold Schwarzenegger was not born bulky. He had to work a lot to become Mr. Universe, right? And eventually, when he became Mr. Universe, he didn't become Mr. Universe one time, multiple times. The idea of Lamarck is that if Arnold Schwarzenegger has a child, that child is actually going to exhibit the same huge muscle, right? Without ever needing to do some work. But we know that, well, this is not completely true, right? Probably Schwarzenegger's son or daughter has to work as hard as Schwarzenegger himself in order to build up the muscles. So while the idea of adaptation is true, but it is conditional, right? It is conditional. Darwin, however, came with the idea that, well, natural selection, it's the motor of evolution. In other words, in nature, changes occur, right? When this change occurs, only individuals who are suited to thrive in that environment are going to survive. Hence, natural selection. So the nature is selecting what organism is thriving and what organism is not thriving. But that organism can only thrive only and exclusively if they have the features for that survival. Now, in today's term, we would say if the organism doesn't have the genetic makeup and that genetic makeup expresses as needed to meet the challenges of a changing environment, unless that organism is able to adapt that way, that organism will not leave behind offspring and will go extinct. That's basically what natural selection is. All right. So Darwin's conclusion was that, well, the Earth is much older than people thought it was, right? Based on the work geologists had done, right? And now we know that fossils can get trapped in the layers, in the crust of the Earth. And what is interesting, it's that some fossils, here we have the trilobites, right? These trilobites live technically in a marine environment. But interestingly, this trilobite are found in fossils that are located on top of mountains where there is no marine environment. And one can wonder, wait a minute. So if these trilobites are aquatic organisms, how is it that we are finding the fossils of aquatic organisms on land and buried in the rocks? Well, the answer is that there was a change, right? Water was at one point in the area where the trilobite died. That water retracted, right? And the trilobite get trapped in the sediments. And this trilobite never decomposed. And therefore, you have the prints of these organisms there, right? So Darwin also observed, again traveling the world, that you had some fossils, including the fossil of the Glyptodon, that is strikingly similar to the modern armadillo, and the fossil of the Mylodon, that is strikingly similar to the modern sloth. They concluded that, well, it looks like the modern armadillo, the modern sloth, they had an ancestor that existed before, but that got modified over a long period of time. So we call this concept descent with modification. Descent with the unity that you had a common ancestor, and that common ancestor underwent a series of changes. And these changes produced a diversity of organisms, so diverse that actually they don't quite fall within the same species as to what we consider species today, right? So they fall within different species, right? And we even see that even within the same species in a population, all individuals are not genetically identical, right? And that variation accounts for evolution, believe it or not. All right. What he also observed is that when individuals were found in similar environments, they tended to develop similar physical features. Hence, looking at the Patagonian hare that occur in South America and European rabbit that obviously occurs in Europe, where Darwin originated, well, he noticed that, well, these organisms are very similar. And why? Because they are developing a response to their environment. So organisms can find themselves across the world, but if they find themselves in the same type of environment, they will tend to develop a similar response, causing them to kind of look like each other, right? Even though in terms of genetics, they may not have the same genetic history, okay? They may not have the same origin, right? So this is what we call convergent evolution. You have different origins, but because of environmental conditions, you end up developing features that are similar. That's convergent evolution, or the study of biogeography. Bio, life, geography, it's geography basically based on different areas. All right. So in the island of Galapagos, Darwin observed 14 different kind of species of finches. And of these 14 different species of finches, it took to Europe 12 of them. And these 12 kind of finches, he compared them. And as he compared them, he realized that, well, these finches were different based on what they were eating, based on the type of habitat, right? Because some of them were arborical, so they would be on top of the trees. Some of them actually were spending more time on the ground level, right? Some of them were having some particular type of songs. Others were singing different kind of songs, right? So these organisms, while they appear different, Darwin came to the conclusion that all these finches, whether they are ground-dwelling finches, woodpecker finches, or cactus finches, all these finches actually developed from a common ancestor. This organism adapted right, to their environment to be able to thrive and leave behind offspring. Now, what is the proof that natural selection is the motor of evolution? Well, the proof that natural selection is the motor of evolution is that, well, one, you have a diversity of organisms in a population. This diversity, only organisms that are able to reproduce and leave behind offspring are able to thrive. Everyone else go extinct, right? Survival of the fittest, meaning that the organism that is able to pass down the traits that are going to be consequently preserved in a population are the organisms that are going to be suitable for the environment, right? So the proportion of suitable trait increases over time for the individuals who have that trait, right? Those individuals who don't have the trait suitable for survival and fitness are going extinct, right? So that is the premise of natural selection, right? Presence of genetic variation, okay? We have here 4 different kind of snails, right? Based on where they live, some of them are going to be easily seen by predators. If they are easily seen by predators, they're going to be eaten. And if they are eaten, that means they're not going to be reproduced. If they don't reproduce, that means they go extinct. Only the ones that are able to camouflage and reproduce, leave behind offsprings, can thrive. Now, organisms have adapted to survive. Let's take a look at this alligator bug. This alligator bug is called alligator bug because actually its head is reminiscent of that of an alligator. Now, when we look at this insect, we can see the eyes right here, and we can see that the head resembles a miniature alligator. Okay, so that when a predator comes, that predator is going to think, oh, this is an alligator, so let me not get close, right? That way, this organism is going to be able to escape the predator. By the same token, and no, not by the same token, but also if a predator happened to be adventurous and disregard this false head, what the organism is going to do is to spread their wings. And when they spread their wings, you see this areas here that looks like false eyes, that looks like eyes, right? So that gives the impression that this insect is actually larger than it is in reality, right? By developing that adaptation, this causes this organism to actually be able to multiply and leave behind offspring. Now, in the mechanism of evolution, we have 2 ideas here as on this slide. We have Lamarck's idea and Darwin's idea. In Lamarck's hypothesis, you have giraffes that are born with a certain length of their neck. As food becomes scarce at low levels, they are going to stretch their necks, right? They stretch their necks and they can actually reach the food. Eventually, by stretching their neck high, they are going to pass that feature of long neck that result from stretching their necks to their offspring. That's Lamarck's idea. But Darwin's idea of natural selection is that in a population, you have different kind of individuals. You have individuals with long necks. You have individual with middle-sized neck. You have individual with short necks. Well, the short necks, if you cannot access food, that's too bad for you. You die. Okay? The long necks, you are able to access food that is extremely good for you. You survive, and you are going to pass down the features that allow you to have long necks to your offspring. That's why this offspring are going to be found, while the short guys are going to be all dead. Okay? Now, selection can be done artificially. All dogs that we see in our community today or across the world can be traced back to the wolf. All right? However, we see that from the wolf to the different kind of dogs, including these two, right? They are extremely different from the dog. And how did we achieve this? Well, we observed this because humans started breeding specifically dogs to actually keep the one they like, right? And we have today dogs of different shapes and size, right? There are actually many dogs that are produced artificially by artificial selection that will never be able to survive in the environment if left alone. If left on their own, they will not be able to survive in the environment. Why? Because they don't have the traits that are needed to actually withstand the competition that is in the environment. That's one. Two, you also have the environmental conditions themselves, right? Regardless of the interspecific competition and the intraspecific competition, you also have the environment itself, right? Dogs with short snoots, for instance, have a hard time breathing, right? They typically won't have a long life because today we have veterinarians who are going to actually improve the health of these dogs. They can actually live a fair amount of time. But compared to wild dogs, you know, the lifespan is not comparable. All right. So you have dog farming that occurs. All right. So more adaptation. You have this this bat that has evolved to be able to move around with echolocation. Now, this bat's ears are designed to actually be able to move around with echolocation, right? And these adaptations don't happen by accident. They happen by necessity. Okay? This adaptation happened by necessity. Well, and I should also say that adaptation does not happen by design, in a sense that one organism says, I'm going to adapt to this environment and grow adaptation. That doesn't exist, right? What does exist, it's that a given organism has a certain set of genetic makeup, and that genetic makeup will happen to be an advantage for the organism or not, right? And an organism cannot do anything about their genetic informations. Once they have that genetic information, they have it. If you do have the gene for suitability for a given environment, good for you. If you don't, that's too bad because you cannot make up DNA. All right, so another guy, his name was Wallace. Wallace actually showed that what Darwin observed, that as he went from one continent to another, that the organism he observed in different geographical area that had similar environment were also looking similar, right? Wallace actually showed that in the Indian Ocean, right, in the Malay archipelago, right, you have a specific line. That specific line is called the Wallace line. That Wallace line actually shows that when you consider the animals that occur in Australia and the animals that occur in one side of the line, and specifically in the Sulawesi Islands, the Philippines, the animals were very similar to the animals that were found in Australia, in Papua New Guinea. However, on the other side of the line, in the island of Borneo, Java, Sumatra, all these organisms were very similar to the closest mainland here. So you can see that actually underneath of the sea, not shown here, okay, there is a separation between this side and this side of the archipelago, okay? All right, so more evidences about evolutionary changes. Now, about fossil evidences here, we do have here a fossil, right? That fossil is that of Archaeopteryx. That Archaeopteryx, if we look carefully, we can see what were the wings here. We can see what looked like the feathers, right? We can see what looked like the legs here, and we can see what appears like the tail, and that tail had feathers. So now when you reconstruct, actually, let me talk also about the head. When you look at the head, we see that the head had teeth, right? When we reconstruct the potential look of the organism, we see that it possibly could have looked like this, right? And paying a close attention to the anatomy and structure of this animal, it's actually somewhere between bird and reptile, right? The teeth, very reminiscent of reptile. The tail, very reminiscent of reptile. And the way actually the bones are spaced or connected in the tail are very reminiscent that of reptiles. Here is another witness of evolution in terms of fossils. When you consider the Tiktaalik rosy, the Tiktaalik rosy actually shows to be somewhat a hybrid between potential amphibians here and fishes here. There are some features that are reminiscent to amphibians, and there are some features that are reminiscent to fish, causing us to think that between this organism here, the amphibian tetrapod, and the fish here, you had an intermediate that would be actually the link between the past and the present. All right, so here, in terms of evolution, we have what we call reverse evolution. Now, we know that historically, when we trace the history of life, life started in an aquatic environment, eventually moved from the aquatic environment to dry land, right? Now, interestingly, for organisms such as this whale here, it is trusted that, well, this organism actually evolved from this mammal that was living on a dry land and did the reverse, went back to the water to completely be water dependent. Okay, there are some features in whales that show that actually the bones in the upper legs here are very similar to the bones in the upper body of the whale here. And the whale also has some bones here that are reminiscent of the back legs. Okay, they are not shown here, but they do have some bones that are buried in their body. All right, some more evidence of connection between living organisms: the sugar glider squirrel, the Tasmanian wolf, okay, the Australian wombat. These organisms actually are very reminiscent of other organisms, while these other organisms live in different locations in the world, in the continents, right? But they have similarities, and these similarities show that at some point maybe the continent were all together and then the continent splitted and started moving apart, right? Some part of the continents remained on the same latitude, right? While other part of the continent end up in different latitude, right? And latitude is associated with climate, right? Okay, so in terms of anatomic evidence, we see that if you consider yourself when it's cold, you have goosebumps, right? These goosebumps are very reminiscent of actually what happens on this cat when they got scared or when they get mad, right? Their hair stands up, right? We likely, when we have goosebumps, our hair actually, stand up. Okay. Now, going closer to, taking a look at what we call homologous structures. Homologous structure. Homologous structures. These homologous structures are structures that have the same origin, but in different species, this structure end up evolving into forming structures with completely different functions, right? So here we have the bones that you find in the bird wings, bones that you find in a bat wing, in a whale, in a cat, in a horse, in a human. There is a conservation on the type of bones in terms of their origin, right? So homologous structures, when we do comparative anatomy, are the structures that have the same origin historically, but over a long period of time, they evolve into different functions. Now, other similarities, here we have the embryo of a chick and the embryo of a pig. When we look at these two embryos, they are very similar. Now, if we were to put the embryo of a human at the very early stage, you are going to see that there is not much of a difference between the embryo of a chick, the embryo of a pig, and a human embryo, which actually is reminiscent of the fact that, well, the origin may have been the same, right? Nowadays, we use a lot of molecular comparison between organisms to see actually how closely related organisms are and how distant they are, right? So when we look at the different types of organisms here, right, by comparing amino acids in a particular protein that we call cytochrome C, that protein show that the analysis and the comparison shows that human and monkeys have a cytochrome C that is more similar than the cytochrome C of a moth, right? And human is closer to a duck than it is to a yeast, right? Because yeast have cytochrome C, moth have cytochrome C, fish do have cytochrome C, turtle, duck, pig, monkey, and human. And so we can compare them and see how closely related they are or how far apart they are. As consequence of that, you have, this drawing that shows you actually chronologically, I mean, not chronologically, but how related these organisms are in terms of differences. And this is where we are going to stop this chapter. Thank you for your attention. Before we say goodbye, I want to remind you that please review the content of the chapter at the very end of the chapter in your textbook, or you can make your own review going through the slide, going through this presentation. Test your knowledge. Test your knowledge by designing questions. For instance, ask yourself, what is natural selection, right? What are the components of natural selection, right? What was the idea of Darwin when it comes to evolution? What was Lamarck's idea, right? What is the Wallace line, right? So please ask yourself a number of questions, test your knowledge, and very importantly, create a handwritten concept map. This is going to help you master the material. Thank you for your attention. Bye now.